It's that time of year again. It is time for the International Manufacturing Technology Show. Every 2 years, the world of advanced manufacturing converges on Chicago, Illinois for the largest advanced manufacturing show in the entire Western Hemisphere. 12,000 students and educators, close to 100,000 attendees in total will be there. We will be there, the Tech Ed Podcast, of course, at the Smart Force Student Summit. We're doing all of this in association with AMT, the Association for Manufacturing Technology. We want to see you there. Stop by and meet the team from the Tech Ed Podcast. We will be there with all kinds of swag for our loyal listeners, and we will be recording all week content that you will hear later on the Tech Ed Podcast. We would love to see you at the International Manufacturing Technology Show in Chicago, Illinois. Welcome to this week's episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. My name is Matt Kirkner. I am your host. Before we get started, a brand new feature. If you are on Spotify, if you're on Apple Music, I think this is supported on just about every platform. You will find a brand new link that says, send us a text. If you hear something on the podcast that interests you, if you want to provide feedback, if you want to give us a review, you can do that in real time. Click that link. Your phone will ready you to send us a text message, and we will receive that information right here in the studio of the Tech Ed Podcast. Well, I've been looking forward to this week's guest for quite some time. He is somebody who is actually an iconic executive producer in the world of entertainment, which is a space that we haven't spent a ton of time here talking about on the Tech Ed Podcast. We are going to go deep this week into the entertainment world. This individual is Eric Newman. Eric is an American film and television producer and the founder of Grand Electric. Get this, you'll know him from his work with Netflix on series like Narcos, Painkiller, Griselda, and before that, he had a really impressive career in the world of film. We are going to get into all of that today. How is technology changing the world of film production? Some of the great actors and actresses that he has had an opportunity to work with over the course of his career. He is not only a very, very well-known executive producer, he is also a personal friend, and it is really, really great to have on this week's episode of the Tech Ed Podcast, my friend, Eric Newman. Eric, awesome to see you, and thank you so much for joining us on the Tech Ed Podcast.
Oh, Matt, thank you. If people only knew how long we've been trying to do this.
Isn't that right?
It's been years. It's been, a number of years.
It has.
Matt and I met, we became friends through skiing, our shared love of skiing, and a mutual friend who happens to train both of us in skiing. And I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me, Matt.
Exactly. And it is funny how life takes us in those directions. And Lance Cole, by the way, listens from time to time to the Tech Ed Podcast. So yeah, he will for sure. So I'll plug Lance right off the bat. Lance, we call the Ski Whisperer. He is just an incredible ski guide in Sun Valley, Idaho. And by total serendipity, that's how Eric and I had an opportunity to meet each other is literally on Bald Mountain in Sun Valley, Idaho. And from there, we've just text back and forth from time to time, stayed in touch, and he was gracious enough to join us here on the Tech Ed Podcast. So for those of you who say, how in the world was Matt Kirkner able to get this really well-known executive producer on the podcast? That's exactly how. So
yeah, Lance called him to thank. And by the way, if you want to buy a house in the Sun Valley area, Lance is your guy.
He is absolutely doing some incredible real estate development out there. I want to figure out, so we talk about really cool jobs. We're going to get into yours in just a moment. How does somebody sort out how to be a real estate developer, a ski guide, and a trout guide? I mean,
yeah, seriously.
That's just incredible career planning on the part of Lance. So talk about career planning. Here you are, an executive producer. We talked a little bit about some of the series that you've been involved with. We're going to go deeper on that. But for our students who listen, especially who are thinking about, man, I'd really like a really cool career. Obviously, you have one. What is the work life and career of an executive producer? What does a typical day look like for you, Eric?
At this stage of my career, I have, I believe, built a process by which I, dedicate a certain amount of my day to finishing the shows that are in whatever stage of, right now I have 2 shows that are in post-production. I am not filming right now, but I've just finished a run of spent the last 8 months making a show in New York with Robert De Niro.
Is that 0 Day? Is that the one? Yeah, with Robert De Niro.
Yeah, which is kind of a thrill. No matter how long I do this, I still am sometimes in awe of some of the people that I get to work with. And I'm also preparing kind of my next round of shows. There are moments, obviously, where, you are with Robert De Niro on set and he's talking to you and asking you if he, spoke your words properly, and that's surreal. But I think overwhelmingly, like anything else, most of the time it's a job with all the annoyances, inconveniences, setbacks of any job. I suppose if you told me when I started out 30 years ago that I would be what I've become in television, I would have been very disappointed to hear that at the time. It's interesting about how our plans, and I'd say this to any student, what you set out to be is often rooted in a particular time in whatever business you're in. When, in the 90s, studios were making collectively hundreds of movies, maybe fewer than hundreds, but, certainly far more films than they were making now. And television was sort of this also ran business that you looked at disparagingly. This is before The Sopranos, before The Wire, before HBO, I think, more than anyone reinvented television. And at the time, I looked at the path that I wanted to be on, and, I was going to be a film producer. And then one day I was going to run a studio, and my path went a completely different direction. And I think I am incredibly grateful for that.
That's awesome. So is that because the world of entertainment shifted from, more kind of the traditional film into television and streaming? I mean, did you follow that trend, or did you have a point in your career at which you're like, hey, I'm going to do something different? Or tell us about that.
It's funny. I made some good movies, and I made a good living, and I would say I was a successful film producer, in my 30s and into my 40s. And yes, the business was changing and continues to change. I would have put myself conservatively in sort of a top tier of, among my peers. I don't know that any of my peers would deny that. And for those of us who were in that position, we didn't feel the contraction. There's always going to be someone making movies, and I was one of those people. Television to me looked like a business that, okay, yeah, maybe something comes along and it makes sense for a TV show. Great, I'll be a TV producer. I'll put my name on something, and I won't necessarily have that much to do with it. But I think what happened, a shift in me more than the business, which was I stopped focusing on what I wanted to be and started really thinking about, what do I want to do? What is the job that I like doing? And I had this idea to do it. This isn't, starting around 2006, 7. I wanted to tell the story of the drug war. I had started it as a film. I wanted it to be a movie because I was in movies. And around that time, Netflix really emerged as this sort of miraculous, kind of insane thing of like, hey, we're gonna create a content company out of what was effectively a mail order video business. And God, they did it. And I saw a path to getting my story told, but as a TV show. And against the advice of all my friends, many of whom, run studios and are big agents and lawyers, they said, wait, what are you going to, you're going to go down to Columbia and work on a TV show? And I said, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And I went and did it, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me in so many ways. There's that great saying about the plan goes out the window the moment you get punched in the face or the moment the shooting starts. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't have a plan going in, but thank God I was able to deviate from that plan and really sort of built, I would say from that point on, really built my business. And I would, had I been more successful as a film producer in terms of if I had had some, giant event, I had found myself producing the Hunger Games or whatever, and had made a ton of money, I might not have done this. I might have said, well, I'm not going to Colombia. I'm not leaving my family to go down to Colombia and do it. So I look back with tremendous gratitude on the path my career took, but almost as much the path that my career didn't take.
That's so awesome. And it's such a great message for our young people. I read a quote last week, and actually I think it was related to like military strategy, but it was something along the lines of, it's not having a plan that's important, it's the process of planning, right? You need to be thoughtful about where things are going, but also be really, really open to the possibility that things can have just tremendous changes. And just for our audience's benefit, when you talk about your work in film, what are like the 3 or 4, I know, and there's tons of them that people would recognize, but 3 or 4 films that you point to and that people would resonate and say, oh my goodness, this is the guy that was responsible for that work?
I would say Dawn of the Dead, certainly, which was also for me kind of a, in my career, it was the first movie that was very much mine. I came up with the idea of remaking this movie at a time when remakes were not the thing they became, at a time when zombie films were not the thing, and TV shows were not what they became. And Zack Snyder, went on to become a massive filmmaker, was a commercial director that I knew and liked. We made our first movie together. I would say Children of Men, has had a life, that's gone so beyond its theatrical release in 2006. Beautiful movie, and a brilliant movie by a brilliant filmmaker, Alfonso Cuarón. I made, James Gunn's first movie, and James went on to do Guardians of the Galaxy, and he's doing Superman now. And this was sort of a horror movie called Slither that was really fun. I think a lot of people enjoyed In Time because sort of conceptually, there's the Justin Timberlake movie, where time has become this sort of commodity that can be bought and sold. And when your time runs out, you die. And if you're poor, you wake up with a day to live, and you got to figure out how to get another day. And it was a sort of, ingenious concept. And then in the Netflix era, I think a lot of people enjoyed Bright, which was one of the sort of first big proof of concept kind of movies for Netflix that, hey, we can make competitive films as well.
That's so cool. So let me ask you this part of it. I want to morph into kind of this whole, fascination that you had with the opioid crisis, and obviously so many of the series that you've done around that. And I've watched several of them, and incredibly well done, incredibly fascinating, captivating. And I think most everybody, and I certainly have had people in my life, and a really close personal friend whose son went through a serious challenge with opioids. And tell me about this. I mean, why that topic? Is this personal to you? Do you feel like you're on a mission? Is it more just creating awesome content and entertainment? What is it about that topic that's had you so captivated for so long?
I've always been interested in people as a storyteller, as a writer, as a, producer. So, obviously, people are at the center of every story we tell. And what's interesting about the drug war, both, Narcos and Painkiller, obviously, there are some subtle and important differences, between, the Sackler family and, Chapo Guzman, but they ultimately do the same thing, which is they sell a product to someone who it's an offer that many people can't refuse. I believe in very few guiding principles of mankind. One is sort of evolution, and how we're developed, our compulsions, the things that we have to have, and maybe unable to deprive ourselves of those things. And then the economics of is there money to be made here? The amazing thing about the opioid epidemic is how far it was able to go before someone said, hey, this is killing a lot of people. And, you get into these sort of arguments of, obviously there's always the free economy, and, it's like, it's legal. I mean, and then you get into, well, why should we deny the people who need this? Because there are a bunch of people who can't handle their addiction. And I think that, when you look at people's sort of take on something like this, you see a very divided America, where there are people who think that, drug addicts should just die, like, well,
Until it happens in their family, right?
happens to them, and I think that it seemed like it has always been a incredibly dramatic lens through which to tell a story that's really about a bunch of people confronting the same problem in different ways. So it's this, I almost want to say it's a uniquely American problem. Obviously drugs are a problem all over the world, but not like they are here. And so I found that fascinating. Both stories are all the stories in this world are tragedies, because we tend to learn nothing from these struggles. And so I've always been interested in it. And obviously, there is some measure of, community service I felt to certainly with the opioid epidemic to show people what this company did and other companies like it, what they did.
And that's Purdue Pharma, right? That's the company.
Purdue. Yeah. And again, they're not a, I'll say very little in defense of the Sacklers, but like, they're not the only one. They're the ones that, I think they didn't help themselves, in terms of how they presented themselves. I think,
Right. Well, and continued to rationalize what they were doing, I think, and that really screams through the message that once, fine, you can say early on that we're dealing with, people's pain issues and we're giving them an opportunity to live a life. And maybe before all the stories came out and we recognized all the risks and all the downsides, that's a story that worked. But at least in terms of how it's presented in the series, they just continued to find ways to rationalize behavior in the name of building wealth.
Yeah. And they, you go on the offensive and you attack the victims, and it's just, what do you expect? I hope we were helpful in getting the U.S. Supreme Court to reject this settlement, because I think it just seemed unconscionable to me that, and when you look at the math of it, that given the amount.
So tell us about the settlement really quick, just for our audience. I know what you're going, but help them understand.
Yeah, so basically, there are a lot of people and a lot of lawyers representing a lot of people who were able to negotiate, to sort of bundle these lawsuits into one super lawsuit. And they allowed for a settlement of, many billions of dollars. I want to say it was $9 billion, but I can't remember. And in return, the Sacklers would be further indemnified from future lawsuits. So it basically would say, all right, you can't sue us ever. No one can sue us ever again. Here's your $9 billion. And, the Sacklers probably have $30 billion, I would think, sort of, out there in the world. I don't know this for a fact, but would make sense to me. Additionally, they continue to make a lot of money selling OxyContin. You can still get, by the way, I was prescribed OxyContin recently. I wouldn't take it. I think I took one in the beginning of my,
That's how I always take one or two and then get off it as soon as you can.
As soon as possible. I just, so, and then, get rid of it. So, they continue to make OxyContin, which helps finance the settlement. And I believe the length of time in which this is payable, they would have probably earned back this in interest. So it was a deeply flawed settlement. However, there are a lot of people who are like, I just want my money. Like, if this is, I've been suing, we've been in it, we've experienced great loss. We want to move on, $9 billion. And by the way, if you're a lawyer representing this thing, your piece, it's like, so, and again, I don't even fault them. But there was a challenge presented, as there should have been, to like, well, wait a minute, they can't be shielded from further prosecution, litigation, lawsuit. That's not, it doesn't work that way. And so the Supreme Court said, indeed, it does not. So they cleared the deal.
It's a phenomenal series. I binged it with my wife over the course of a weekend, and you can't hardly stop paying attention to it. It's beautiful. Matthew Broderick, by the way, the antagonist, playing Richard Sackler. What was it like to work with Matthew?
I loved him. He was a very inspired choice. I was like, well, Matthew Broderick, he is great. You forget all the stuff he's been in.
Right. You think of Ferris Bueller and then everything in between. It's like, oh my goodness. Yeah.
It's a War Games and The Freshman and, Biloxi Blues and the producers, and I'm, talking to him, at dinner in Toronto, and I'm like, I'm talking about Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I'm like,
That's awesome. Yeah.
it's just crazy. So yeah, that was that's one of those moments where you kind of are like, this is surreal.
It's got to be, right? Yeah, working with some of those folks, and we'll talk about some of the others here in a little bit. You haven't touched on Griselda, by the way, which I also watched and thought it was just really, really well done. Fascinating story of Griselda Blanco, who I'll admit I wasn't overly familiar with until I watched the series, and it's just really, really great.
Oh, thank you. I'm very proud of that show. I love the people with whom I made it, Sofia Vergara and Andy Bice and Doug Miro, and people that I really enjoy working with and have been working with for a while. And I'm so glad Sofia was nominated for an Emmy, and I really hope she wins. She deserves it. She really showed up for that show, and she very much was the driving force behind it. And that one is interesting, that despite claims to the contrary, there's never been a woman in the narcotics trafficking business quite like that. It's a completely male-dominated profession in a completely male-dominated culture. And it's unthinkable that, what she accomplished. And I think that our goal in telling that story was to veer away from the very kind of tired and uninspired narrative that she was just some like demon. And that was invented by men to explain wait, let me get this straight. How did you guys let her become she was so terrifying. It's like, no, it's never that way. If you worked for her, you loved her.
There's some really interesting leadership lessons that are buried in that series, just in terms of how she generated, and again, not commenting one way or the other on whether what she was doing was right or wrong, but just how she generated this incredible loyalty among the people around her, and really gave them, at least as the story is told in the series, an alternative to the life that they had without her. And I think there's just some great leadership lessons in that.
She recognized a familiar need in them because she had the same need. It's why if you can relate to people and they feel it, I mean, you can, you get them to do anything.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit, because we've talked about the evolution of your career, the evolution of the type of work that you're doing. Let's hit on the evolution of the technology. I mean, is it pretty much the same as it was in the 90s, or has it changed significantly, and how?
No, I mean, it's changed in pretty much every area. I haven't, shot on film, it's all digital. In the old days, we used to, and this is the old days, like, 2003, we would have to create what was called a digital internegative so that we could alter the hues and colors and things. And now, it's always you can do it in the camera as you're shooting. There have been technological advancements all over the place. Some of them are not as good as, I think we tend to think. I found that, and it's still true, that the practical special effects, the guys that will do, your latex head exploding, and the guys that will do it digitally, everybody feels like, oh, what this needs is more of what I do,
Right.
Or, then it's still somewhere. I think that, a marriage is still sort of the best.
First time, by the way, the words latex head exploding have been uttered on the Tech Ed podcast, for what that's worth. I don't know that we've
Be the last. So, I think the challenge obviously is, you rely on technologies that are not infallible. There have been times when we've entertained big ideas. There's something called a volume stage, which is this entirely digital environment that gets created, and it's cool, and you're like, wow, that's great. And then I think when you get into actually working in that space, it's a little more challenging than perhaps you thought. Certainly more expensive. James Cameron has been able to do some pretty spectacular things and very kind of cutting edge. Not everyone can do what James Cameron does. I think a lot of times the technology is in the hands of people who don't understand it. And I encountered that a lot. I was always interested enough to kind of know how it all works, but
Right. I was going to ask that. How do you learn it? I mean, how do you, as technology changes, how do you go about staying fresh in terms of your skills?
I mean, it's almost impossible to really learn it, unless you're really in it. I tend to pay attention to the people who my VisFX producers and supervisors and people who are, actually staying up to speed with the new developments. What's really been interesting, obviously, and more so in some ways than the technology with which we make these things, is the technology with which we distribute these things, exhibit these things, where, very simply for almost 100 years, studio makes a movie, it ends up on a reel, it's a film reel, and it put on a truck, sent to, some movie theater somewhere, and you do that.
Right. And this isn't 100 years ago, right? I mean, this is still like,
It was for about 100 years,
yeah,
and then you show your movie and at some movie theater, and then a few months later it's available on video, and then beyond that you get it on pay TV somewhere, HBO, wherever, and by the time the cycle is over, particularly with the economics of video, which is why a lot of the battles that go on now about compensation, when we have these big, it's why people go on strike, is that video was the best thing that ever happened to the studios and the worst thing that ever happened to the people who make films, with one caveat, which I'll get to. When video was a nascent idea, it was expensive. People didn't have video, machines. It wasn't a thing. And so the studios were able to charge an exorbitant distribution or handling fee for this kind of useless technology that was video. And I think if I remember correctly, it was 80% of the revenue that came in through video was just the studio's corridor. They just kept it.
yeah, and they controlled the means of distribution, and that was the only way to get to the audience.
And but the money. So
Yeah.
if you had a giant DVD or video, and it continued in a DVD, if you had after it became a mass market, if the studio made $100 million on video alone for some giant title, they took $80 million immediately off the table. And then you, as the creator who was entitled to 5% of the revenue in those days, I got 5% of the 20%, not 5% of the 100%.
Not of the 100.
So rather than getting $5 million, I got, 5% of 20 million. So I got $400,000. And that was, for creatives, that was a disaster. The only thing that I'll say in the studio's defense is it almost guaranteed that the studios were not going to lose money on a movie. Very rarely would they really lose money, because there was always some aftermarket that would help sort of, and especially at that, royalty rate,
Right.
They were only having to share a piece of the 20%. They were doing great. And as a result, they made more movies. There were probably movies they're like, yeah, we'll make that because we can't get hurt.
Sure.
DVD goes away, as it does eventually, and then here comes streaming. And when we get into sort of renegotiating all these things, I think streaming, similarly, people underestimated what it would become. I mean, Netflix, if you really think about Netflix, you'd have to put them with Apple, Microsoft, Ford Motor, like companies that just
transformative.
Wow, how did that?
Yeah, absolutely. And you were Hemlock Grove, if I'm not mistaken, was like the second, right? Wasn't that like the second series made specifically for Netflix? So you were right on the front end of this.
And I take, honestly, to go back to my sort of plan and lack of plan, I take no credit for any kind of foresight. I had a meeting with them. They seemed cool. The magic words were straight to series, which means you don't have to do a pilot. We'll just say, here, go.
Huh.
And it was like, all right, great. I have no idea what I'm doing. And they're like, yeah, but we don't care. You'll figure it out.
That's awesome.
And, and I did.
That's a mantra of my life, by the way. We'll figure it out when we get there. Yeah.
You'll figure it out. I believe that. I think if you're, smart and you care about it, you'll figure it out.
But it really does speak to, I mean, I think a couple different things. And it's not necessarily, the people that we think of as being true visionaries, the Bill Gateses or the Steve Jobs or whatever. For most of us that get credit for maybe having some vision or foresight, it's really, I think, about being in the right place at the right time and then being able to capture that opportunity when you see it and recognizing it for the opportunity that it is. Speaking of recognizing opportunities, I'm curious about the opportunity that AI might present to the world of production in a couple different fronts. The work that you do, Eric, maybe the writers and directors. I mean, do you see that as transforming the space or not so much?
So it truthfully depends on the day. I'm not afraid of AI. Obviously, there are some pretty significant legal hurdles in terms of copyright and the like, and liability and the like. Someone will need to get over. I also believe that we will get over it. Someone will figure it out. The other thing that you often hear people say is, well, a computer is not going to write the great American screenplay. Yes, it will. At some point, it will. So, of course it will. On a personal note, I have a real problem with, in this era, the idea of a robot or a computer taking anybody's job. Like, there is definitely, like, what's everybody going to do? Like Uber Eats. Like, there is a bit, an industry of people who, I'm not looking to replace. We've done and have always been doing replication of sorts. Sometimes there's a CG person, that is face replacement. If we're doing a stunt, we might put the actor's face on a stunt performer.
Yeah, which you couldn't do without that technology, right? Obviously. Yeah.
But we have the permission of the actor.
Of course. Both of them.
My feeling about AI is if the actor is okay with, hey, if you want to put words in my mouth that sound like me saying them, if they sign off on it, if the estate of Burt Reynolds or wherever I read recently has made deals to allow them to continue to be represented, like, I think that's kind of weird.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely weird.
It's going to work, but maybe it will.
Right.
I mean, so I think that there is definitely a fair amount of alarm. Some of it is legitimate. We've been doing crowd replacement stuff, tiling and, whatever else for forever. There are a lot of CG extras. Those are not real extras. You sometimes can't do it. So, I think like everything else, it'll find a form that everyone can kind of live with. But, I definitely feel like everything that is thought of as an overcome, will eventually be overcome.
Sure, absolutely. One, it's where the line is drawn, and we talk a lot about nuance and the whole world of artificial intelligence and in technology. Of this, very few of these technologies are good, bad, right, or wrong. It's a question of how you use them and who gets to issue their permission and whether it's computer generated or not. All those kind of things that I think really important considerations as we think about how that world is going to be transformed. I want to switch now to a topic around maybe a story or two of some of the amazing people you've worked with. I mean, here we've got Eric Newman on the Tech Ed podcast, got to literally talk about Ferris Bueller with Ferris Bueller, right? Got to talk about Ferris Bueller with Matthew Broderick. You've worked with folks like Will Smith, Jamie Foxx, Wesley Snipes earlier. Chris Farley, who is actually a student at Marquette University, where I graduated from years and years ago. David Spade. I mean, you've worked around all of these incredible names. Do you have a story or two that really resonates over that career, Eric, of somebody that our audience would recognize that they would really appreciate or enjoy?
Oh man, I have so many Farley stories. I went on the podcast at the anniversary of his death a couple months ago with Dana and Spade. Farley to me I loved him. He was completely sober in those days. This is before he moved back to Chicago and started using again. And he was sweet and funny and incredibly graceful, sort of in how he could really move for a guy his size. And I remember we were doing the Nancy Kerrigan ice skating routine, which has become, famous. It was actually difficult for Chris to pretend to be as bad as he was because he was actually a phenomenal skater. Like, yeah, it was, and there were a lot of those moments. Like he could really dance and he could, and he was sweet. The reality is I haven't worked with many people that I don't like, and again, I've worked with a lot of really, really famous people. My favorite celebrity story, in a lot of ways, the most valuable lesson I learned was, and I'm a big fan of his as a performer, as a person, and I thought what happened to him was wrong. And anyone who knows anything about what I do, what we do, knows that it was not his fault. But Alec Baldwin, my first job, I worked at Saturday Night Live, and I was a kind of a chaperone for the host. A pretty simple job, but Lorne Michaels has built this system. I love systems. I love, like, here's what we do. We go here. It's like I think that it's just I think that's what actually allows you to be nimble. I love MMA. I don't get to watch much of it anymore, but I do love it. And one of the things that's amazing about MMA is how important it is to stay in balance. If you're in balance, you can move forward, backward, sideways. You can throw this kick, that. It's like it's all being, what allows you all the optionality is the structure of being in balance. So SNL is incredibly regimented. I could tell you if it's a show week, which it's not because they're off for the summer, but if it was a show week, I could tell you exactly where everyone is right now, 30 years ago. Like, I know where Lauren is. I know where, the head writers are. It's not the guys that were there when I was there, but there's a real regiment to it. So my job was to accompany and guide the host through this regiment. Like, at 9 p.m. we need to be here, and then we're going to go this, and this, you're going to meet this guy, and we're going to go here, and then it's dinner, and then I'm a bit of a gopher, a bit of a tour guide, all that stuff. But Alec Baldwin is the first host that I have. And I developed this amazing relationship with him. Like, he's really funny and really cool and smart. And he was married at the time to Kim Basinger, and she was around a bit. And he would give me a ride home every night. And he was like, you're, going places, kid. And he's 22 years old. And he actually, this is another thing. Like, I at this stage of my career, I truly judge the people I work with, particularly the famous people, with, do they ask you any questions? I've spent months with, actors, directors, and stars who haven't asked a single question. And that to me is always like, all right, yeah, got it. But Alec Baldwin, great, tons of questions. And, always talking, interested in, who my girlfriend was at the time. We part ways at the end of the week after the show, and he's like, listen, you have my number, stay in touch. Well, great. I got Alec Baldwin. Here I am in the, it's my first, week in business, and I'm already friends with Alec Baldwin.
Yeah, life is good.
3 weeks later, I run into Alec Baldwin in the lobby of 30 Rock. He's going to do some NBC thing, and I'm on my way into SNL, and I see him, and he has no idea who I am.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
Huh.
And by the way, there was no, how dare he, or like, it was none of that. There was no like, how dare he. It was just, got it. Like, this is the, and I think it's true in, in a lot of politics. It's just like, I think you could meet Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, will pick your guy, and think you've had an authentic connection with this person, and you haven't. And it was for me, it actually took a lot of the pressure off of, it informed the way I interact with celebrities. It's, as Matthew Broderick said, with some of these people, it's a little bit like the hands of a clock. And when they're on you like this, it's great. And then they just move past you, and that's it.
You know, I left a job. This is now 30 years ago. I was working for a government official in the state of Wisconsin, and key part of his staff picked him up for work every day, dropped him off at home every night, the whole 9 yards. And that was the life that I lived, working for this particular individual. And when I moved on to another role, he and his wife sent me a card, and it was like, people come into and out of your life, and we're so happy to have had you in our life for this period of time. And initially, back then, I was almost a little bit offended by it. I'm like, what do you mean into and out of your life? I mean, I picked this guy up every day for work for a year. But the truth is, it's true that when you're on, when that relationship is important both ways, then you're doing that important work, and you can't, you're always going to keep this library of close friends who are with you through thick and thin in your whole life and so on. And I'm blessed to have that. But you do have these people that come into and out of your life depending on what you're doing. You learn what you can from each other. You enjoy your time together, and you move on. I do want to take one moment to ask you one final question here on the Tech Ed Podcast. I know you're going to have a great answer to it. It's a question we ask just about every guest when they're on, and that is, we're going to go back in time, right? Back to that 15-year-old Eric Newman. Your whole life is in front of you. Tell us, if you could go back and give that 15-year-old Eric Newman one piece of advice, what would you tell him?
I think I would say what I realized at age 42: stop worrying about what you want to be, and focus on what you want to do.
For sure. Yep.
And, only in the ignorance of outcome, where you have no idea. I don't know if it's going to work. I just know that I like doing this thing every day, and I find a comfort in it. And I have the humility to say, it might not work, in which case you get the opportunity to do it again. There's that great saying, though, something like, with every failure comes another opportunity to get it right. But I definitely do think, if I could tell myself one thing, it would be, yeah, it's great you have a plan, but don't worry about the plan. Just go and do that thing you like doing. And that's what I want for my kids, to be honest. Like, I just want them to like what they do. There's, most of the people that I know that are unhappy in what they're doing, they got into it for the wrong reasons. And there's, I want to make a ton of money, and so I got into finance, and I hate myself. Or my parents want me to be a doctor, and now I'm a doctor, and I hate it's like,
right.
I was fortunate to have at some point been presented with, like, oh, I like doing this. This is what I'm going to do.
Absolutely. Focus on what you want to do, not necessarily what you want to be. You never know what the outcome is going to be, but life has a way of surprising us along the way. Your life is a perfect example of that. All the incredible success and all the lives that you've influenced as a result of your work, Eric. You should be really, really proud of that. Absolutely. This was so much fun. I'm so glad we found time for it. And best of luck with all the work you're doing. Here we are. Didn't even really have much time to get into 0 Day, but I want to make sure our audience knows that that's on the way.
We'll do another when that comes out next year. We'll hop on, and maybe I'll drag some of the folks that made it with me on. If you're interested,
that would be so much fun.
I can't always deliver, Bob, but I can try.
Well, we've got this mission here, and what we find, Eric, is that when we tell people that we're all about securing the American dream for the next generation and reaching the people that are changing lives and the lives of those students themselves, very, very few people say no to us. So I'm hoping with the right message, maybe we'll make that happen. But in either event, we'll have you back. This has been wonderful and awesome to see you. Well, this conversation on this week's episode of the Tech Ed Podcast was great fun for me. As you can tell from the episode, Eric is a friend, and so we got to have more of a casual conversation, and also somebody who has done so much incredible work in the world of entertainment and interacted with so many incredible people. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. If you did, please let us know. We would love to hear from you on social media. We are all over social media, as you know. We also have the best show notes in the business. You can find those at techedpodcast.com/Newman. That is techedpodcast.com/NEWMAN. Thank you so much for being with us on this week's episode of the Tech Ed Podcast. Until next week, I am Matt Kirkner. Thanks for being with us.